This video is brought to you by Skillshare. With all the media attention focused on Israel's looming ground invasion of Gaza, in the background the Israeli economy has started showing signs of strain. The shekel, already one of the worst performing currencies this year, has slid to a 7-year low, and Israel's domestic economy has stalled as war-related uncertainty undermines consumer confidence. While none of this should come as a complete shock, and Israel clearly has the fiscal space to fight a localized conflict, the risk of regional escalation and further political fragmentation do pose significant threats to the Israeli economy. So in this video, we're going to have a look at Israel's economy, why it was already under pressure before this month's events, and what impact the coming war might have. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Let's start with a bit of context. Now, there's a popular story that's often told about the Israeli economy that separates its economic history into two periods. Its social democratic period, which runs from 1948 until the mid-80s, and its capitalist period, which begins in the mid-80s and has continued on to this day. Yep, you heard that right. It's almost hard to imagine now, but Israel was actually a pretty left-wing country in its inception. The constant threat of war after 1948 and the socialist nature of the kibbutz made Israelis pretty keen on big government, which allows David Ben-Gurion's left-wing Labour Party, or its forerunners, to dominate Israeli politics until the late 70s. Anyway, in this narrative, Israel's economic potential was squashed by socialist regulation and planning, and its economic success should be credited to the neoliberal reforms implemented in the 1980s by Prime Minister Shimon Peres. In tandem with the Israeli central bank, Peres cut government spending, raised interest rates, and devalued Israel's currency, the shekel. The plan was a success. Israel's inflation rate quickly came down from its 1948 high of nearly 450%, and after a brief dip, Israel's economy started growing at a solid rate of about 5% a year. Ever since, the reforms have been credited as the foundation of Israel's economic miracle, and paraded as proof that right-wing economics are better than left-wing economics. However, while it's true that the reforms were successful in stabilizing the economy, this narrative at least misses out perhaps the most impressive part of Israel's economic story, which comes in the 50s and 60s. After declaring independence in 1948, Israel faced a deep economic crisis. As well as having to recover from the destabilizing effects of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, it also had to absorb hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees from Europe and almost 1 million from the Arab world. Unemployment was high, growth was low, and foreign currency inflows were limited. However, from about 1952 until the 70s, the Israeli economy grew rapidly, with GDP increasing by an average of about 10% per annum and GDP per capita by about 6%. This was partly because of American aid and German reparations, but it was also because the Israeli government used that money to protect and nurture certain domestic industries, including agriculture, textiles, and diamond processing. In 1950, Israel's GDP per capita was about half that of the UK, but by 1972, it was basically equal. Unfortunately, Israel's economy took a turn for the worse in the 70s, for two reasons. First, and most obviously, war. Israel fought and won a brief war against its Arab neighbours in 1967, but it was the 1973 Yom Kippur War that really changed everything. While the Israelis did eventually push them back, the Arab states made rapid gains in the first few days, threatening the integrity of the Israeli state. In response, Israel basically went onto a war footing, with military spending going from under 10% of GDP to nearly 30%. The other reason the Israeli economy struggled is oil. After the 1973 war, Saudi Arabia and other Arab oil exporters declared an oil embargo, pushing prices up by 300% almost overnight. Prices stayed high until really the mid-80s, and this was bad news for Israel's economy given it imports basically all its oil. In this light, Israel's economic history is therefore perhaps better divided into three periods: its social democratic period, which runs from 1948 until 1973, what we might call its war period, which runs from 1973 until the mid-80s, and its modern period, which runs from the mid-80s until today. Anyway, however you split it, Israel's economic story is one of success. In part, thanks to a booming tech sector, Israel now has one of the highest GDP per capita in the world, and is widely considered the most developed country in the region. However, in the past year or so, Israel's political chaos has put its economy under strain. Netanyahu's controversial judicial reforms and the direction of Israeli politics have caused Israel's tech companies to shift operations abroad. And even before this month's events, the shekel was one of the worst performing currencies this year, going from roughly 3 shekels per dollar to nearly 4 in the year to August. The prospect of war has exacerbated the shekel's decline, which has now fallen past 4 shekel to the dollar, despite the fact that the central bank has spent $30 billion worth of foreign exchange reserves to defend the currency. The government has also signalled its intention to borrow more to fund the war, but Israel's debt rating has already been put on review for downgrade at Moody's and Fitch, the two big credit rating agencies, and the cost of insuring Israeli debt has spiked in the past month, which means borrowing will be significantly more expensive. Nonetheless, while it might be expensive, Israel can clearly afford a localised conflict. Even leaving aside the question of US military and financial aid, Israel itself has a lot of fiscal space. Israel's debt to GDP is only about 60%, and the central bank is sitting on about $200 billion worth of foreign exchange reserves. However, there are two caveats worth mentioning here. First, if the war expands into a regional conflict, then inflationary risks will obviously increase. The shekel is already on the decline, and Netanyahu will want to both increase military spending and keep public spending high to boost his flagging approval ratings, especially as domestic economic activity slows. This is especially true if an expanded conflict pushes up oil prices, as happened in 1973. Second, the long-term impact really depends on how the war affects Israel's politics. Israel's economic elites were already warning that Israel's rightward shift and the controversial judicial reforms risk undermining its high-value industries, especially its tech sector. If Israel reacts to the conflict by shifting further right, or by giving more political power to the ultra-Orthodox Haredim, who are due to account for something like 25% of Israel's population in the coming years, then Israel's appeal as an international tech hub might well wane. The point we're trying to make is that Israel has always had a secular traditionalist divide, and if the coming war accelerates the shift away from secularism, which was already happening thanks to demographics, then Israel's society, and therefore its economy, will change as well. A few weeks ago, we told you that we were making a physical newspaper, but it turns out that designing a newspaper isn't all that easy. So we headed to Skillshare to take their course on the topic. Unlike when Jack tried to learn InDesign for another never-released project a few years ago, this time he was guided through the process quickly and efficiently, and this time the project will actually see the light of day thanks to Skillshare's incredibly easy-to-follow guides. In fact, here's an exclusive little preview of what we've been working on. It's not just that either. You likely already knew Skillshare for classes and things like photography, editing and illustration. But did you know that Skillshare also has hundreds of career-focused classes too? That's courses on everything from how to start a business to maximising your workflow or how to grow in e-commerce. Another course that Jack's taking to help him with the newspaper. And if you use our link, then you can get access to all of that for free. That's right, the first 500 people to use our link will get access to one of Skillshare's best offers. 30 days free and 40% off your first year of Skillshare membership. That's the best Skillshare offer we've ever had, so make sure you click our link in the description. Thanks for your support, and to Skillshare for sponsoring this video.